debate start, we had to make sure that all T's and I are crossed and I's are dotted. On 11 March 2018, the Minister of Finance, upon recommendation from the then Registrar of Banks, placed VBS Mutual Bank under curatorship. On that date, the South African Reserve Bank announced that all retail deposits up to an amount of 50,000 rands per retail depositor will be guaranteed by the government. However, to manage the severe cash constraint at the mutual bank, daily limits were placed on how much depositors could access. Today, we are pleased to announce mechanisms to repay qualifying VBS retail depositors. Following discussions with the National Treasury, government has provided a guarantee to the SARB to facilitate the repayment of all retail deposits up to 100,000 rands per retail depositor starting from Friday, 13th July 2018. Retail deposits are defined as deposits in VBS by individuals, burial societies, stokvels and savings clubs, collectively referred to as retail depositors. The guarantee does not cover municipal or corporate deposits. After considering several options and based on specific criteria for how we could give retail depositors access to their funds, we have decided to use Nedbank to facilitate the repayment of retail depositors. The criteria for selecting a repayment medium included proximity to depositors, cost structure, speed of execution, the complexity of having multiple mediums, as well as the advice provided by the curator of VBS. We also looked for a payout institution that specifically provides similar types of products as VBS offered to its customers, in case VBS clients should choose to leave their deposits with the payout institution. How do VBS retail depositors access their funds? The process by which retail depositors may gain access to their funds will commence on Friday, 13th July 2018 and will run as follows. 1. Retail depositors can visit any Nedbank branch from the 13th of July 2018. 2. Retail depositors will need to present their South African identity document or another accepted form of identification, for example, a South African passport, and proof of address. Nedbank will also use a biometric system which is linked to the Department of Home Affairs to verify retail depositors' identities. 3. Retail depositors will be asked to sign an agreement ceding their rights to their claim in VBS to the SARB up to an amount of 100,000 rands of their deposit. This is to make sure that depositors understand that once they receive their deposits back through Nedbank, they no longer have a claim on the same deposit that they had with VBS. Nedbank will open an account for each person or party and load this account with a balance equivalent to the amount of the guaranteed deposit at VBS. Each individual account holder will be issued with a new bank card. Stokvels, burial societies and savings clubs will not be issued with cards and will have to transact at Nedbank branches. 5th, retail depositors will have 3 years to claim their deposits. Retail depositors will be able to access their money from the 13th of July 2018 onwards. The 1,000 rands a day limitation will no longer apply as it did at VBS. Once retail depositors have obtained their new bank cards, they can choose to either leave their money in their new Nedbank account, withdraw all or part of the funds at any ATM or Nedbank branch, or move the money to another bank account with any bank in South Africa. In addition, retail depositors may use their new Nedbank cards to make payments at any retail store. Retail depositors' funds in their new Nedbank accounts will be secure and accessible for up to 3 years and there should be no push for people to withdraw their funds. We appeal that patience be exercised, as the infrastructure at Nedbank branches in Limpopo will be under pressure if everyone attempts to access their funds on the first day. Even though retail depositors will have access to their full balances, for security reasons, retail depositors are advised not to withdraw large amounts in cash, but rather to keep their money in their new Nedbank account or transfer it to another bank. To facilitate the smooth transfer of personal and account data from VBS to Nedbank, VBS branches will not be able to provide cash withdrawal services from start of business on Tuesday, the 10th of July 2018 onwards. VBS branches will remain open for queries, client education, and loan repayments. Retail depositors will, however, not be able to access their funds, not even the daily 1,000 rands per individual and stocks fell, and 7,000 rands per burial, as is presently the position. Retail depositors or account holders who have more than 100,000 rands deposited in VBS will only be able to access their deposits up to 100,000 through their new Nedbank accounts. The amounts in excess of 100,000 rands will remain as deposits in VBS. These deposits will remain valid, and depositors may receive a portion of their amounts above 100,000 rands in future, depending on successes in recovering loans and other assets due to VBS. This is, however, not certain nor guaranteed. It is estimated that about 97% of the 22,700 VBS retail depositors will receive all of their money. We are mindful that some retail depositors have larger amounts deposited in VBS. Together with the curator, the SARB and the Prudential Authority will continue to work towards recovering as much money owed to VBS as possible. Municipalities, larger businesses, and other corporate depositors will not receive any of their funds at this stage, as these are not guaranteed, but will retain their deposits in VBS. As the curatorship continues, the emphasis will shift to recovering monies owed to VBS. We urge all customers who have loans with VBS to continue paying their loans, as they are still legally obliged to do so. People may face penalties and other sanctions if they fail to pay monies owed to VBS. VBS customers are requested to continue issuing VBS infrastructure and branches to repay their loans. Forensic investigation. There has been extensive media coverage around VBS in recent weeks. In this respect, we wish to state the following. The forensic investigation led by Advocate Terry Mudawi SC into possible fraud and malfeasance at VBS is still in progress. We expect the investigation to be completed by late August or early September this year. Initial findings of the investigations were made available to the curator by the South African Reserve Bank. The curator has used these preliminary findings from the investigation to launch urgent applications to take steps to recover monies owed to VBS. This took place on Friday, the 6th of July, 2018. This was a necessary action required by the curator to prevent the dissipation of assets belonging to VBS. Third, at a suitable time, evidence documented by the investigator will be handed over to law enforcement authorities and the South African Revenue Service. In the opinion of the curator, the 2017 financial statements of VBS did not present an accurate account of the mutual bank's financial position and are thus being restated. This process is likely to take a few more months. Only once this process has been completed can a definitive assessment be made about VBS's true financial position and the future of the mutual bank. Similarly, until these financial statements have been reissued, it is difficult to assess the amount of monies that may be recovered and what proportion of other depositors' funds is likely to be recovered. The SARB would like to thank the curator for his work so far. This has been a difficult curatorship, and the announcement today detailing the mechanisms to repay retail depositors will make his work easier, though his work continues. The SARB would also like to thank Nedbank for agreeing to partner with the SARB to facilitate the return of retail depositors' funds. The repayment of retail depositors will go some way to ease the hardships suffered by many people over the past 4 months. We thank affected stakeholders for their cooperation and patience with the curatorship, and we call on clients of VBS to remain patient. We would like to stress that retail depositors will have access to all their funds at Nedbank branches up to a limit of 100,000 rands per retail depositor starting from Friday, the 13th of July, 2018. We appeal to people not to all rush at once to claim their funds as their deposits are secure. That concludes the statement, and at this stage I would like to turn to you for any questions that you might have. And as usual, please identify yourself and the media house that you represent, and we will distribute the questions here accordingly. Let's start here in the front. Yeah.
Governor, the name's Angelo Coppola from China Global Television. 3 questions for you. Could you give us the criteria that was used to select Nedbank as your partner in this endeavor? Secondly, what about bank charges? Are they going to be higher or lower than they were with VBS for your retail customers? And then thirdly, who collects the outstanding VBS loans? Is it going to be Nedbank's job or the curator's job? Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was another hand here in the front. Yes, sir.
Sorry. Dewald from Rensburg City Press. I have a few questions. Perhaps I shall leave some for later. First of all, do we have an estimate of the cost of this guarantee? I mean, how much money are we talking about for everyone under that limit? Do we have an estimate of retail deposits not covered by the new guarantee in money terms? And I suppose the question has to be, seeing what we've seen in the affidavit of Mr. Rupal last week, how on earth was this done without the SARB knowing or seeing in the course of last year? I mean, I think that's a fair question at this point.
What is this?
The bank, the way the bank was run, essentially fabricating deposits and so on. I mean, its reports to the SARB must have been entirely fabricated, one assumes.
Any other? Okay, sir. There is a button there, you press it, and then the microphone will, yes, like
thank
that.
You. Thank you, sir. My question is to...
name and...
sorry. My name is Konati Manchanja. I work for Financial Mail and Business Day. My question is for Mr. Rupla. What are the hopes of saving the bank as we stand? And the allegations you make in your affidavit, sir, has anybody been charged criminally for anything so far? And are those the alleged thieves, if we may use that term, are those the most high profile that you have identified so far, the directors of the bank? Any others that we may know of? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will let the curator go first, and to deal with Sikonati's questions, but in so doing, also deal with the question of the criteria you used to arrive at recommending Nedbank as a partner. Yeah, and then we will deal with that. And Naidu, if you could deal with the cost of the guarantees, that 300 odd million, and what has not been covered by that. So let's start with you, Curator, and then I will take the few here.
Okay, thank you, Governor. In terms of the criteria, we came up with essentially predetermined criteria, objective criteria, in order to choose a payment medium or an entity to affect the payments to the depositors. The one was the locality. In other words, the institution had to have branches in close proximity to the current VBS branches. The last thing we want to do was to inconvenience our clients. The second aspect was around fees, and we looked across the board as to who would offer our clients similar or better fees. An important one is around the institution having the ability to offer similar products. In other words, the clients that VBS has are Stokvels, burial society. So does the qualifying institution have similar products? That was the other criteria. And I think the last criteria was, is the institution must be a registered commercial bank. Those were amongst the 4 criteria that we looked at to objectively identify a suitable institution in order to effect payment to our depositors. In response to the other questions, there's 3 of them. What are the hopes of saving the bank? I think, yes, in light of the affidavit and the filing that and the proceedings that I've instituted on Friday, I think it's important to understand perhaps that aspect. So as the curator, I have instituted civil legal proceedings in order to recover monies owing to the bank. One of my duties as a curator is to recover assets belonging to the bank. So I think it's important to understand that is a civil proceeding. As mentioned in the governor's address, the investigation is still ongoing, and whatever may come from there, will be passed to the Reserve Bank, who in turn passes information on to me for me to make a determination as to whether I pursue further people in terms of recovering monies due to the bank. And I think what's important is that my focus is to recover money owing to the bank. That then leads to the hopes of saving the bank. And I think one needs to put this into context. Clearly, when I commenced my duties as a curator, the issue then was a liquidity matter. It was one of a liquidity issue. And that was on 11th of March 2018. And naturally, the curatorship team geared itself to resolving or solving a liquidity crisis issue. During my assessments in those early weeks, I then uncovered various irregularities, governance breaches, major control weaknesses, and so forth. That then prompted me to request the Reserve Bank, the South African Reserve Bank, to initiate an investigation, and which was duly done. And that was around 13th April, if memory serves me correct. Naturally, that's been a process. It's been a a long process. And that's attributable to the sheer scale of the fraud that has been identified. It involves the depth of the fraud, the workings of the fraud. There's a lot of related parties implicated and certain identified parties. So most certainly the individuals and the Vela entity that was identified are the starting points of recovering assets as far as the curator is aware. So in essence, the curatorship process has been significantly derailed by the fraud, and added to that, I did not have a credible set of financial statements to start off with. So that certainly helped derail the process. So we are not as confident as we were when we started the curatorship as to restoring the bank. We are now less confident, and that's where we stand at this point in time. Until such time that the financial statements can be restated, I will be in a better position to make a further assessment as to how can we restore the bank further. I think I've answered then the last question as to the more high profile individuals. I think, as I've alluded to, as and when the investigator makes available information, I then would act on that to recover assets. Thank you.
Angela, you asked the question, who's going to do the collection? As we say in the statement, that the branches would be open, but not for withdrawal services. The bank is still under curatorship, and it is still responsible for the collection of or any outstanding monies due to the bank under the leadership of the curator. Van Rensburg, Naidu will deal with the cost of the curatorship. It's some 300 odd million, but he will give you the precise figure. You posed the question, how did this thing happen under the watch of the bank? Let's start from basic principles. Regulators don't run banks. Shareholders who create banks apply for a banking license, and there are particular regulations to adhere to, which are not just domestic regulations, but are a translation of international standards into domestic law. Let's be clear. What has been happening at VBS is fraud. The regulator is not there to be detecting whether an institution is being defrauded. The board and the management of an institution is supposed to have proper systems of controls and governance to make sure that fraud is detected, is prevented, and if it's detected, it is dealt with. Fraud is a crime. And in the same manner that when another crime takes place, you do not ask the law enforcement authorities, where were you when the crime took place? You can't ask the regulator. Fraud took place in VBS, where were you? Because you see, when fraud takes place, it becomes a law enforcement issue. And we can't even turn and say to the police, where were you? In institutions, it's important that there are systems and structures of governance to deter fraud, and in the event that fraud takes place, detect it and deal with it decisively. Of course, in this case, you are dealing with a difficult situation. From what the curator had been saying, you could see that some of the people that the curator is pursuing are the very people who were supposed to be watching over the institution. Members of the board, executive management of the bank. These are the people whose job it is to govern the institution and make sure that fraud does not take place. And in this case, it seems to be that there is evidence that they themselves, if they haven't committed the fraud, might be complicit in the fraud. There is a forensic investigation that is taking place, and I am sure we will be much wiser when it comes out. But I guess the subtext of your statement, where were you, could also be that, well, this bank has failed. Why didn't you prevent it from failing? Once again, regulators can't prevent a bank from failing. Regulators will enable a bank that is run recklessly to fail without pulling down the system. Our responsibility as regulators is to the depositors and to the banking system. And that is why today we stand here and we announce what we are doing for the depositors. That is what our responsibilities are, is about the depositors. And why is it important that the regulators' focus should be on the depositors rather than on the shareholders or all the others? Is because take away depositors, there is no banking. There is no banking. All of you who want to borrow money, you want to borrow money from depositors. And that is why at the heart of the regulation of the banking sector is the protection of depositors. Once you do not have depositors, once depositors lose confidence in the system and they take their money out of the system, you do not have a system to talk about anymore, and we are all poorer after that. Naidu, I think I might have dealt with if you must deal with the money and any other thing that I might have missed.
Two issues, Governor. The first is that the total amount guaranteed is about 336 million rand. The total retail deposits in VBS is somewhere around 360 to 370 million. The number is slightly imprecise because there were some deposits that were fraudulently created. So to the best of our calculations, let's call it 370 million for want of a hard number, which suggests that the amount of uncovered deposits is around 40 odd million, thereabout, that range. 97% of depositors by number will receive all of their money. Just one more issue, that when the investigation is completed, we will hand the investigation report over to the law enforcement authorities. The actions that the curator has taken is a civil matter. It's a civil proceeding aimed at recovering assets, monies owed to the bank. Once the investigation is concluded, we will hand it over for criminal sanctions if the prosecutors or the police think that there are criminal infringements.
Before that, Mr. Minele?
I think there might have been a question that we could have missed. There was an issue around the collection of remaining loans as such, and I think a quick point in that regard, the cooperation with the Nedbank deals only with the deposits that are covered under the guarantee. Everything else, those amounts that are over and above the 100,000 limit, as well as loans that people have taken out at VBS, remain with VBS. There are obviously legal obligations that people need to deliver on. They need to service those loans and repay them, and that all stays with VBS, obviously under the direction of the curator, who's vested with the management powers at the moment.
Sir.
Good afternoon, Warren Thompson from Business Day. Just perhaps a question for the curator, Mr. Ruplal. Just spell it out for us, sir, if you can. What percentage of the balance sheet or the asset base of the bank are you actively trying to recover through the civil actions you've undertaken on Friday, as well as any other action you anticipate recovering? And then I also wanted to understand that as soon as the National Treasury now has had to pay up roughly 330 million rand to guarantee the deposits, is there any action being considered by the Reserve Bank or the National Treasury to sue the partners of KPMG or KPMG itself, as well as the bank's internal auditor, PricewaterhouseCoopers, for what appears to be fairly gross negligence? And just a last question, Mr. Ruplal, you indicated the financials are going to be restated. Can you give us an indication how far back those might need to go, and whether or not the asset base that was reported in the most recent financials, if that figure was accurate, or think that's going to be restated as well? Thank you.
Thanks, Warren. Tsepo?
Good afternoon, Tsepo Mwai, SABC News. I just want to find out from the governor, should the bank fail, the guarantee that the government has put, is it going to be lost? Is it not going to be recovered? And the second question is on the budget for the curatorship. How much? It looks like there's still a lot of work that still needs to be done. How much is the budget, and how much is it still going to be needed? Yeah, and then the last question is on mutual banks. Will things change going forward for those who want to apply for mutual bank license? Thanks.
Any other new hand before I go back to Van Rensburg? Okay.
Sorry, just one question for Mr. Ruplal. Your affidavit is largely based on an affidavit by the former treasurer of VBS, who has turned on his fellows, so to speak. What is the arrangement precisely there? Because he implicates himself in a great deal of crime. I mean, is he protected somehow? What's the deal, if I may put it that way?
Any others? Yes, Kosnash.
Can you tell us, Mr. Ruplal, if those people who hold loans, like the high-profile 7.9 million rand loan to Jacob Zuma, are they at all performing? And I know, of course, there's very big loans that were handed out by the bank. Is any of those people paying back the money? Thank you.
Is that it? Okay. Curator, you're very popular this afternoon.
Okay, in terms of the size of the balance sheet, in my affidavit, the curator is looking to recover amounts of approximately 1.5 billion, because that, per the analysis and the information made available to me from the investigator, amounts of approximately 1.5 billion has been siphoned out of the bank. So clearly that's the amount that we are looking to recover. With regards to questions around KPMG and PwC, my comments are general comments in this regard, and I think as the Governor has alluded to as well, the Board of Directors has a duty, vested management has a duty to protect their interests and act in fiduciary capacities, and so forth. And clearly the risk management function is an important function in a bank. Likewise, your external assurance providers, KPMG being external auditors and PwC being internal auditors, yes, clearly that's an important function as well. As to whether we would sue them or not, again, that would be driven by the findings that will come out of further from the investigation, and those clearly has to be assessed. Matters like independence of the service providers, the ability to raise the flags early, so forth, those are the factors that are of concern to me. And one could argue, yes, these matters should have been picked up. But clearly, this is something that we will and are looking further into. At this point in time, I can't really comment further as to what legal action will be taken. I will heed advice from the investigator and my legal team in conjunction with the Reserve Bank as well. In terms of restating the financial statements, how far back do we go? I think this has been a challenge of note, this curatorship. And as mentioned, I did not have a credible starting point. So 2017, most clearly I have to restate because I need a baseline. I need a point of reference. And from there we will reconstruct and see what the 2018 looks like. One needs to get to the truth in the numbers, and to get there it takes time and effort. And the process, I've got to follow due process to make sure I get to the right numbers. So that is going to take some time, to say the least. I will then assess whether it's feasible or not to restate years before that, because the cost benefit of that one we needs to assess and weigh that. I think I'll ask Kuben, Deputy Governor, to assist me on matters around curatorship, budget, and mutual bank licenses. I think those are more for.
Yeah, they are for him. Yes, you are right.
Thank you, Chair.
Sure, thanks. Just the first issue is that whether the bank fails or not will not determine whether the guarantee is called. Whether we can't collect sufficient assets to repay the Treasury, that will determine whether the guarantee is called. If you take the total amount of deposits in the bank and the total amount of loans in the bank, even if conservatively stated, we're quite optimistic that there are some good loans in there. There's what I would call a traditional mortgage loan book, in some ways the old traditional business of VBS. Many of those loans are performing. So we're quite confident that we will not have to tap taxpayers' money, but I can't say that for certain. Once the process of recovering loans is well underway, I think we'll be able to get a better sense of whether that guarantee is at risk. There is a risk, certainly. Our view at this stage is that there are sufficient quality assets to be able to recover the 336 million rand in the guarantee. The budget for the curatorship, differs from month to month. On average, it's around 2.5 to 3 million a month. And that's not just for the curator, that's for an entire team of people, team of about 20 people, including accountants, IT people, security people, etc., to be able to manage the curatorship, the legal processes, all of that. The law says that the curatorship, the cost of the curatorship should be recovered from the bank. So that is the position at this stage. What's the budget going forward? My guess is that there'll be a significant reduction in cost now that the requirement to pay over retail deposits is taken away. That was a significant share of the costs of the curatorship. But I don't have a clearer sense going forward on what those numbers are. I think it will come down. On mutual banks I think they have a place in the system. They're designed for a relatively small community-based scheme where depositors own the bank. In our view, VBS got too big to be regulated through the Mutual Banks Act. And over the last 2 years, we repeatedly asked them to apply for a commercial banking license. What would be nice is if in law there was the provision for the regulator to insist that they upgrade to a bigger license once their size increased. But for a relatively small bank, I mean, we've got other mutual banks that are run fairly well, community-based type institutions. I think there's a place for them. I think what is unhealthy is when you get what I would call regulatory arbitrage. You use the Mutual Banks Act as a legal framework to effectively run the operations of a commercial bank. I think that that's an unlevel playing field. And in an ideal world, the regulators should have the legal instruments to be able to insist that a bank upgrades its license so that there is a more intrusive framework for licensing and for regulating them. There was a question from Kosanati about loans to high-profile people. I think Anush will give you the same answer I'll give you, that we're not going to mention names of people involved. That's not fair. There's certainly client confidentiality in relation to the bank that we would like to protect unless there's a specific legal action against an individual and therefore it'll come out in court. We're not going to name any high-profile people who have loans or report on whether any particular individual is paying their loans or not.
Just to underscore that the forensic investigation is continuing. We would like to get clarity from that investigation so that appropriate action can be taken. And that appropriate action, as we had stated, would entail reporting to the South African Revenue Services. You know that you might receive a bribe. If you have received a bribe, it is income. South African Revenue Services can tax it, even if it is a bribe. And secondly, we have got reason to believe that fraud has been committed in this bank, and to the extent that we are able to establish that fraud has been committed, we will hand that information to the law enforcement authorities, and hopefully prosecution successfully so takes place. Lastly, I just wanted to state that as the Deputy Governor Naidu stated that the guarantee, as far as we are concerned, it's covered or will be covered by enough quality assets in the bank, that we must understand that the Treasury has not put the money. It's the Reserve Bank that has put the money on the strength of the guarantee of the Treasury. And it might be a few years down the line, depending on how much of the assets have been recovered, that we would know whether a portion of that guarantee would actually be called. At the moment, as Naidu said, we think that there might be enough assets to cover it. But to the extent that those assets are not realized, or it takes time to realize them, it could take a while before that happens. I thought those were the last questions I had asked. But, okay, I'm taking absolutely the last round of questions. Any new hands? Yes, ma'am, you are new.
Governor, thanks for the opportunity. It's Anna Montero from Bloomberg News. So today's announcement pertains to the retail depositors. I was just wondering if there were any plans afoot to help the 13 municipalities that have more than 1 billion rand invested in VBS. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Susanna?
Please confirm VBS future. Is the bank going to be closed and any job losses? His second question is, how many clients do you estimate will be migrated to Nedbank due to this process? And how much will Governor make available for this process? I think that's been answered.
Warren?
Thanks, Governor. Just certainly take your point on the fact that the regulator never advertises to be at the crime when it takes place. But certainly, from the Reserve Bank's point of view, and certainly an institution I think that prides itself on the strength of our banking system, has this given you pause for thought yet as to perhaps how the regulator can do its job better? Stopping short of actually going and auditing the banks yourself, is there perhaps a weakness or a blind spot in your risk analysis and the way the work of the bank is done that you think can be improved from this lesson? Thank you.
Van Rensburg.
Sorry. I'm not sure I caught the answer about the Treasurer and his affidavit and whether there's some kind of dispensation for him. And following on what Mr. Naidu said about regulatory arbitrage, what was it that triggered, at what point did you think that they should stop being a mutual bank? Because we know there's plans afoot to also use the mutual bank structure to create a branchless bank by some well-known entrepreneurs in the country, for instance. Is there a level of deposits where it's no longer, what is the point where it shouldn't be used?
Okay, thank you very much. Bloomberg, plans for the municipalities. Our duty is to the retail depositors. Municipalities had no business placing deposits with VBS. They knew they are breaking the law. They did it anyway. And even after the Treasury issued a circular that said, it has come to our attention that some of you are placing deposits with a mutual bank. We refer you to the Finance Management Act that says that you cannot place deposit with any other bank other than a commercial bank. You went ahead and you did it. What actually happened after that circular is that even more was placed with the deposit. So we take it that these were the people, these were institutions like the corporates who knew what they were doing, had all the capability to do their own due diligence. They knew what they were doing, and they will have to stand their line in the queue as we look at whether there are enough assets to cover everybody. They would have to put their requests through the estate. Wall Street Journal, would VBS be closed? Well, I wish you were here. No, we have not said that it would be closed. Well, with all that we had said was that when we put this bank under curatorship, we were fairly confident that the bank would make it through. And we said that we are less confident now. What makes us less confident now is because, as the curator said, that the financials of 2017 would have to be restated. And until that restatement has taken place, we would not be able to take a position or view as to whether this will be able to continue as a bank. How many clients? Well, VBS had 22,700 clients. 97% of them would be able to recover their full deposits with VBS. And then Warren, doing better, yes. We always think we can do better, but we are doing very well. If you were to take this municipal, just based on the municipal deposits, this is a 1.5 billion rands bank. The assets of the South African banking system are about 12 trillion rand. 12 trillion rand. So by any measure, this bank, if you were to measure whether it is systemic or not, and you were to apply the criteria of whether it is size, whether it is complexity, whether it is interconnectedness, this is not a bank that would have a knock on the financial system. Nevertheless, it is a bank that served a very important segment of our community. And it is for that reason, like that, when we looked at this and we said that these are people who normally in our settings here in the urban areas, we would say, oh, these people can't save, they do not have money. These are people who were able to mobilize their savings. And it's just a travesty that the failure of management in VBS put these deposits at risk. Fortunately, we were able to step in and that we could save 97% of these depositors. Blind spots, well, we can't see any. We have got a very rigorous regulatory framework. Our supervisory processes are robust, but no supervisory or regulatory framework, however robust it could be, could second guess what management is doing if management is determined to commit fraud. And so, when you supervise an institution, you rely on the institutions of governance, structures of governance in that particular bank. So you would expect of a bank to have a risk committee with a chief risk officer. You would expect of a bank to have a compliance officer. You would expect of a bank to have some form of an asset liability management committee. You would expect of a bank to have an audit committee. And you would expect of a bank to have some robust internal audit function. And of course, assurance providers in the form of external auditors. That is what we supervise. We would ask whether those, all of those things are in place. And if representations are made to the regulators that falsify information, that information that is submitted to the regulator, certified by the auditors, and you place reliance on those quality assurance providers, and yet crime takes place, there isn't any amount of regulation that could go through that. The history of bank failures in South Africa had shown that all the banks that got into trouble and had any prospects of failing, where they were saved, it was because the governance structures continued to work, they had the systems and so forth, and more importantly, there was no indication of fraud taking place in those institutions. Once you have issues of fraud in those institutions and you have boards that are making misrepresentations and structures that makes misrepresentations, then there is a problem. Be that as it may, it is practice in South Africa that whenever there is a bank failure, and this one has not yet failed, that we institute an inquiry, and in that inquiry, we ask the questions about what were the things that were missed by management, boards, and so forth, but importantly, where did the supervisors miss it? And if there is anything they had missed, did they miss it because they didn't implement the law, or did they miss it because it was not provided for in the law, or did they miss it because there was misrepresentation from the regulated sector? And based on that report, you then ask the question, should I make changes to any of the regulations? Should I make changes to any of the supervisory approaches that I take? And that has been the history of regulation in South Africa. And that is what has made our regulatory framework robust. Out of any of the bank failures of the past, our regulatory and supervisory system came out stronger and stronger, because there is every bank failure you could learn. So when there is a bank in trouble, I always tell young supervisors, if ever you want to learn anything about banking, that's the bank you want to be involved in. Because there is nothing that you could learn at a desk or in a textbook than having to deal with a bank that is in trouble. Once you have learned that, you can tell a bank that is in trouble from a distance. And I conclude by saying, this bank, VBS, had been under heightened and intensified supervisory action for some time. And at some stage, they ended up having to seek additional capital, which they did. But as some of the stuff that comes, it looks like the capital didn't end up in the bank, it ended up elsewhere. But once this forensic investigation is done, and once this inquiry is done, we will be able to tell you for sure where our failures are. We did the same recent with the bank that was resolved in 2014, and the report was publicly released so that there could be a proper discourse about these things. You had another question about the treasurer.
Yes, so the investigations are being conducted in terms of the Financial Sector Regulation Act, Section 140 to be precise. And in there, it grants immunity against the use of evidence in criminal proceedings. And I think that's a question that Advocate Terry Motau and the legal team on that aspect can provide more clarity on those aspects. I just want to again emphasize that my role is to recover assets, and I've instituted civil legal proceedings in order to recover those assets. It's important to understand that. And I think there was one last question on whether there will be job losses and so forth. So the bank as it stands is in a dire financial position. Amidst all the aspects that I've mentioned, it has a bloated cost structure, there are unprofitable branches, and my job now really is to curtail costs to make the bank fit for purpose. So unfortunately, I have no choice but to implement a retrenchment process, and we will act responsibly in terms of the relevant labor laws, and we have been informing staff of that accordingly. So we will act responsibly and make sure that we do this sensibly, taking into account the interests of staff.
Thank you. At this stage, I would like to...
What size threshold? I don't think size would be the only criteria. I think business model would be a criteria as well. So, in this case, the bank grew from about 500 million to about 2 to 2.5 billion. I certainly think they crossed a threshold in terms of size. But size wouldn't be the only criteria. Business model will also be a key criteria, depending on whether the bank lends or not, and the relative risk of that lending book. I think that the fit-for-purpose mutual bank, that you can be too big, or you could have a business model which is not consistent with being a mutual bank.
Thank you very much. At this stage, I would like to invite Nedbank to share with you the communication approach that they have starting today with respect to the VBS customers. Mike?
Thanks very much, Governor. And just to say on behalf of Nedbank, we're pleased to have been requested and to be able to assist the over 20,000 VBS depositors, the Reserve Bank and the banking system. And also particular thanks to my colleagues in retail and business banking led by Tico Thomas, who couldn't be here today, and Dave Schwegman for a huge amount of work to get us to this stage. Working with the Reserve Bank and the curator, we're really trying to make sure that we can deliver as efficiently as possible. So we've taken numerous measures to make this as efficient as possible for people who are already suffering incredible hardship, and we'll continue to evaluate these. But to give you some sense, so first of all, we do have the ability at Nedbank to automatically load all of these accounts through robotic process automation. We also are, together with the curators, communicating with all of these customers in the next days via SMS, firstly from the curator and from Nedbank. Those SMSs will be in Venda, Sepedi and in English. We are going to hold town hall sessions both in Thohoyandou and Makadu to enable the retail depositors to come into those town hall sessions so we can explain the process and answer any questions that they may have. We are extending the operating hours of our branches in those areas both during the week and over weekends. We have 6 branches between Thohoyandou and Makado, and we have 16 ATMs in the area, so we do have extensive infrastructure there. We're also sending 4 mobile branches to the area, and we are initially going to have some VBS staff working inside the Nedbank branches, so for the VBS depositors there are familiar faces when they walk through our doors. And then finally we'll also make sure that we have very senior staff on the ground in both Thohoyandou and Makado on Friday and thereafter. So I hope that gives you some sense of the effort that we're putting in to help these depositors.
Thank you very much, Mike. That concludes the proceedings of today. Thank you very much for your attendance.
You're watching SA.